Hey everybody, welcome back to English 221. This is for a class for Wednesday, the 26th, where we are talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. So at this point, you should have seen the play in its entirety, A Midsummer Night's Dream. As you know, we are watching a version that is copyright protected, so you need to see it through the GCC library, and there is a time limitation on that particular version, which was filmed in the Globe Theater, Shakespeare's reconstructed Globe Theater that we had talked about earlier in the semester. I've seen many versions of Midsummer Night's Dream. Of course, each version has its own strength and has its own weakness. Many of you indicated that you weren't particularly fond of the Oberon character. His name's not John Light, by the way. John Light happens to be the person who created that particular production. But regardless, one of the things that I think you will see is how important interpretation, actor interpretation, and director interpretation is in terms of understanding a text. One of the directorial choices that they made, which I thought was quite clever, was having the same actors play Oberon and Titania and Theseus and Hippolyta, because they really do mirror one another in the play. And the couples as a whole mirror each other in the play. A play that is a Shakespearean comedy, so it's about love and all of its misunderstandings, with a lot of music and dance, which we saw in this particular production, and also a happy resolution. Though, of course, Shakespeare likes to complicate things. So, in the notes below, I have some considerations of things for you to consider with A Midsummer Night's Dream. Think about the title, for instance, Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, the idea that a dream can be like love, or that love can be like a dream, something that's out of our control, something that can be negative, like a nightmare, or it could be positive, like a good dream, something that is not real, and perhaps love itself is an illusion in some respects. Nighttime. And the times of the day are oftentimes used to symbolize different states or different possibilities. Nighttime, a time of darkness, a time of magical supernatural possibility, but also a time that's associated with eroticism. And this is a very erotic play, something that isn't talked about perhaps in the K through 12 level. Usually, this is a play that's done with younger audiences because you don't have death and because it's about love. But Midsummer is a pagan day in the calendar, and it is known as one of the most sexually charged pagan days in the calendar, along with May Day, which is also referenced in the play itself. So, whether or not you're talking about the equinox or you're talking about May Day, both of these days are associated with fertility and celebration. And the way that they would be celebrated is through physical fertility. So you might have heard of the maypole, for instance, and the maypole is actually a phallic symbol. Children don't necessarily know that if they're dancing around a maypole because it's a day that's associated with fertility. So Shakespeare deliberately puts his play in a setting that's associated with the time period with fertility, and at the same time is trying to emphasize the importance of virginity for female. Society is oftentimes filled with contradiction and contrast, and that's something that Shakespeare will show us as well. And the idea that no one is immune to the difficulties associated with love is illustrated in all of the different love couplings that we have. I'd indicated that this play is notoriously confusing. We've got a lot of different relationships and shifting back and forth from relationship, in part or mostly because of that magical love spell. And that's another commentary on love, that perhaps love is like a spell, and we are under some sort of outside influence or control when we are in love, and it is irrational oftentimes and blind. So think about the idea of how some of these characters, granted through love juice, but nevertheless still can fall in love with each other when in the real world that would never happen. I suggest keeping a chart of all of the characters. Some of the names are similar, Helena and Hermia, so it's easy to get them mixed up. But Helena is the tall blonde, Hermia is the short brunette. They are best friends, and it's important that they have different physical appearances because at the time period, we talked about this a little bit with the sonnets as well. Tall and blonde was considered to be the epitome of beauty, so that should be Helena. And yet, at the start of the play, no one is interested in Helena for a romantic relationship. Everyone, or I should say the two men, Lysander and Demetrius, are interested in Hermia, the short brunette. That's going to lead to jealousy and tension between these two female friends. And we're also going to get some backstory that prior to the play, Helena was indeed involved in with a relationship or in a relationship with Demetrius. So he's fallen out of love with her, which goes to show how fickle love is, another commentary on love. And he's fallen in love with, of all of the people, Helena's best friend, which is Hermia. And these best friends will soon become best enemies, which illustrates another element about love, how easily friendships can be destroyed because of love. And love is magical but also tragic, exhilarating but also humiliating, sometimes requited, sometimes unrequited, and we're going to see the contrast of all of that with all of the relationships. We have a play that begins in the city in Athens. This was not uncommon for Shakespeare to put his plays in exotic locales, but outside of putting it in an exotic locale, it may as well be London. The city is supposed to represent reason, rationality, order, the law of man. And when Shakespeare gets all of the characters into the forest or the wilderness, that which is wild or untamed, again, the erotic possibilities increase, and this is when the magical spells occur. So we know that Helena and Hermia and Demetrius and Lysander are basically of the noble class, but that doesn't preclude people from higher classes or couples from lower classes from having their own love difficulties, because we are also introduced to Theseus and Hippolyta. This Hippolyta being the former queen of the Amazons, a very strong Amazon, female race is the Amazons. So she was defeated by Theseus. So she's obviously not too happy about that. And we can see power struggles within the play, but we know that in the end we're going to get a happy ending. So the reality is that by the ending, it seems that there's a certain level of affection, even love, that's developed between Theseus and Hippolyta. This is not an unusual coupling, a coupling that occurs for political reasons. Again, she was conquered in war. The unusual coupling happens with Hermia and Lysander, because Hermia and Lysander are defying Hermia's father's will. And at the time, the father was considered to be the supreme authority next to God. So Hermia's father has made the decision that Hermia should be with Demetrius, further complicating matters because, of course, Demetrius was once with Helena. And of course, the fact that Hermia dares to defy her father, or even more interestingly, she successfully defies him so that by the ending of the play, she gets her will, I think is a very interesting commentary about the power of female in a play in a time period that didn't necessarily give voice to female. I've always argued that Shakespeare is a progressive in many respects, and I think we see that in many of his portrayals of female. And that said, we've got basically the nobles who are dating, in effect, for lack of a better word, but we've got the king and the queen, and that happens to be Theseus and Hippolyta, who are engaged. Yet another stage of relationship, and certainly another social station of relationship, but they all have difficulties. And even the supernatural realm has difficulties. One would assume, with the chain of being, with the hierarchy of all of the characters, that fairies or supernatural beings would be above human beings. And that means that Fairy Oberon and Fairy Titania should not be having love problems. But oh, yes, they are having love problems. And it happens to be over an issue of power or control. They are a married couple, so this represents yet another stage of relationship, but that doesn't protect them from difficulties. Oberon wants a changeling boy, which actually is part of fairy lore. Shakespeare would oftentimes use fairy lore, but change it for his purposes. A changeling is a child that is exchanged by fairies in the middle of the night. So they leave a fairy child there and they take the human baby. This is one of the ways in the Renaissance where perhaps parents could explain having a child that seemed different or that they didn't necessarily approve of. They could say that this wasn't their biological child, it was a changeling. It had been exchanged in the middle of the night by fairies. Shakespeare takes that idea, doesn't really pursue the idea of the exchange, but pursues the idea of ownership or property. That Oberon, as the male fairy figure, basically the husband, demands something, in this instance, a changeling, and his queen dares to defy him, which again would have been seen as unheard of. And notice that at the ending of the play, Titania does not get her way. She's humiliated. So while we have a Hermia, a human who gets her way and is able to perhaps illustrate her power over her father, we don't see the same with fairies. As we talked about at the beginning of the semester, don't expect easy answer from Shakespeare. We'll oftentimes see contradiction. And I think the actor who was playing Oberon really wanted to illustrate that idea of the power dynamics between the two. I agree it might be a little bit heavy handed, but of course, actors are responding in part to their directors and the way the directors envision this. And as I had indicated, I think it's brilliant that we have Oberon and Titania and Theseus and Hippolyta played by the same two actors, because these two couples basically mirror one another in that they are kings and queens, one in the human realm, one in the fairy realm. And they both have power issues in terms of relationship, and they also have relationship difficulties. This is a comedy that has some darkness to it. There's some negative commentaries that are going on about love. And of course, we're introduced to Bottom, the laborer. So he's all the way at the bottom of the chain of being. He's below all of the other characters. Note that he's not involved in a love relationship. Now, some of you had mentioned a version of Midsummer Night's Dream that was done in 1999 with Kevin Kline and Callista Flockhart. Actually, I myself show that version in my Introduction to Literature class. And I think it's very well done, but one of the things that I think they do poorly is they give Bottom a wife in that version. And of course, if you read the play, Bottom doesn't have a wife, nor is he involved in any love relationship. I think this is important. And the reason why is because ultimately, once Bottom does become involved in a love relationship, we see what a true ass he is. And of course, this is a wink and a nod from Shakespeare. Shakespeare presents us with a character who's an ass, who wants to play every part, who's arrogant and egocentric, who basically uses all kinds of malapropisms, misstatements, and we see how he ends up being the subject of affection of the fairy queen, no less, the most magical, beautiful being in the fairy realm, illustrating that love is blind again, and also the power of love juice or magical spells, that it's as if you're under a magical spell when you fall in love. And Bottom, who is transformed into a literal ass, after all, he is a figurative ass. There's also a sex joke in here because at the time of the Renaissance, the ass or the donkey was viewed as the most well endowed creature. And it's fairly clear from many of the productions that they consummate their relationship, Bottom and the fairy queen. So, a word like bestiality could come to mind when you're thinking about a seemingly innocent play like A Midsummer Night's Dream. And of course, Bottom is necessary for Shakespeare's fifth act, where we get the play, within a play, where we get a story within a story. Very Shakespearean to put a play inside of his own play, very meta, so that he can do commentary and mirroring of what we've just experienced. And that fifth act might seem to be superfluous, but trust me, it's not superfluous. So we'll see Bonham and his cohorts act out their play, Pyramus and Thisbe, which happens to be about, of all things, love, which makes sense because Midsummer Night's Dream is about love. But Midsummer Night's Dream ends happily. Pyramus and Thisbe is a tragedy where the lovers actually commit suicide. It might remind you of Romeo and Juliet, which is thought to have been written around the same time. But Romeo and Juliet is a well written play, and Pyramus and Thisbe is a poorly written and poorly acted play. But more on that in a few moments. So the character that's left is Puck, and Puck is usually a perennial favorite. Puck is not involved in a love relationship ever throughout the course of the play. Perhaps this is why he's able to comment and reflect on love relationships in a way that other characters can't. There is in fairy folklore a Puck or Robin Goodfellow, he goes by both names, a mischievous fairy that's meant to create havoc, but not to harm. So we're told in the play that he does things like makes your milk curdle, or perhaps he trips you, but he's not going to hurt you. And the idea of the actor playing Puck, more often than not, this is considered to be the lead role, Puck. But there are lots of great roles in here. And as many of you indicated, the actor who plays Bonham does, and I agree, in my opinion, a really terrific job of bringing that character to life. I personally am not too impressed with the actor who played Puck. I've seen better Pucks, including in the 1999 version of A Midsummer Night's Dream that I was referencing earlier. That Puck is played by Stanley Tucci, who you might know from the Hunger Games. I've seen Puck played in a lot of different ways, older, younger, male, female. Because Puck is a fairy, there's lots of interpretive possibilities as to who can play Puck and how to play Puck. But I think that the actor who is playing Puck, at least in comparison to some of the other actors, comes off a little bit weaker. Of course, this is all subjective, but Shakespeare is ultimately meant to be performed, which is why I wanted to introduce you to a performance. But a performance is in no way a substitute for actually reading the play itself, which is where we are now. And hopefully you finished reading the play so that you can begin our second play, which happens to be Much Ado About Nothing. And once again, we'll watch a performance. And once again, we'll talk about the play itself. And then eventually you'll have the opportunity to write a paper, and we can talk a little bit more about writing papers after we have put some closure onto A Midsummer Night's Dream. I've given suggested paper topics, but those are merely suggestions. You can come up with your own ideas. And what I've done in the notes below is I've tried to give you a sense of what's happening with the plot. As I had indicated, Theseus and Hippolyta represent one level of relationship. They're the engaged couple. Hippolyta has been conquered in war, and this would be a fairly typical kind of love for the time period. Hermia and Lysander, they're younger, they're nobles, they are a dating couple. Hermia defies her father, which would be rather atypical. And the fact that she successfully defies him at the ending of the play is even more atypical. Helena and Demetrius, who once were a couple and no longer are by the beginning of the play, illustrate how fickle love is. And the fact that Hermia is still in love with Demetrius illustrates unrequited love, how it's possible to love somebody who doesn't love you back. Fairy Oberon and Titania are the married couple, and of course, as fairies, they're higher up on the chain of being, who are arguing over their changeling boy, so they have the power struggle. While Bottom and his cohorts, who provide humor but also commentary, are rehearsing a play about love. And basically, Hermia's father, in despair, goes to King Theseus and has the highest order of the land tell his daughter that he should follow his father's will. Note that Hermia's father never indicates why he wants Hermia to be with Demetrius rather than Lysander. Because it doesn't matter. Both men are pretty equal. All that matters is that the father has made a determination. And the fact that a daughter A female dares to defy that? That's rather progressive for the time period. And it's the same thing with the fairies, Fairy Oberon and Titania. Oberon never really says why he wants a changeling boy. We can speculate. Perhaps he's jealous with the amount of time she's taking care of this boy who basically she feels a sense of responsibility for because one of her serving women had died in childbirth. So she's raising the child. But we aren't given a lot of detail because in the end, the husband wants something and the wife dares to defy him. And again, that would have been seen as absolutely outlandish during the time period. However, we see that by the ending of the play, not only is Titania put in her place so that she has to lose the changeling boy, but also she's been humiliated by, through magic juice, falling in love with, of all things, Bottom, who is a laborer and has been literally turned into an ass. So it is rather dark and mean spirited. Theseus, or I should say, Oberon, Fairy Oberon, is a rather dark character. I think maybe you pick that up with the actor's portrayal of that. So King Theseus orders Hermia to follow her father's will and either face a nunnery or death. Both would have been considered to be almost equally bad. But he does give her time to think about it. This is important from a plot perspective because if he didn't give her time to think about it, we wouldn't have time for them to make the decision that maybe many young lovers would make, which is to run away. And of course, this leads to the whole plague that occurs afterwards. They decide to run away into the woods. Again, that represents the wilderness, wild, untamed. Before they go, Hermia decides to tell her best friend, Helena, that they're running away in the woods. Not a very smart move, but after all, that's her best friend. And what does Helena do? First thing she does is that she tells Demetrius that the woman that he now loves, Helena's best friend, Hermia, is running away in the woods with her lover, Lysander. And this shows how love can get in the way of reason and rationality. Because in her convoluted thinking, Helena thinks that Demetrius will be so indebted to Helena that Demetrius will want to get back together with Helena. Makes absolutely no sense. But that's what happens when you're in love, is you're not able to think clearly. Of course, what Demetrius decides to do is to go into the woods and try to fetch Hermia. And this means that Helena is going to follow him in the woods. And it's also a clever plot device from Shakespeare because now he can get all four of these lovers in the woods. And of course, the fairies, Fairy, Oberon, and Titania, live in the woods. So the only set of characters that we need to get into the woods at this point would be Bottom and his cohorts. And they give the reasoning that if they rehearse in the woods, they'll have more privacy. I don't know whether or not we can agree with that reasoning, but nevertheless, that puts them in the woods so that now all of our major characters are in the woods so that Puck, through the orders of his master, Oberon, Fairy Oberon, is able to spread love juice and create havoc. But I wonder about servitude and mastery in this play. Oberon is supposed to be the master and Puck is supposed to be a servant. But yet, without Puck, none of this could have happened. It almost reminds me of real life situations in the workplace where the CEO could be absent and the work continues just fine. But when the administrative assistant is gone, everything comes to a standstill. So perhaps the one who seemingly has the most power really doesn't have the most power. And that is something that we can examine in the Puck and Fairy Oberon relationship. But at any rate, Fairy Oberon comes up with a scheme to get that changeling boy, that he decides that the love juice shall be placed on Queen Titania's eyes, so she falls in love with the first thing she sees. Because when we are in love, we tend to become distracted. And that which we previously cared about, like changeling boys, or work or school or whatever the case may be, we no longer are interested in. Again, I think a very valid commentary about love. And Puck does put the love juice in her eyes, and Puck decides on his own, he's mischievous after all, when he sees Bottom, who acts like an idiot, rehearsing in the woods, he's going to turn Bottom into, well, the idiot that he truly is, an ass. And of course, that just happens to be the first thing that Queen Titania sees. So she falls in love with the literative and figurative ass because love is blind, another commentary about love. And Oberon is quite thrilled with these turn of events. Again, he's a very dark character because this is a way not just to get the changeling boy, but also to punish his wife for daring to defy him. Not just defy him. At one point, she says, I have forsworn his marriage bed. Translated into our English, that means that they aren't having relations, intimate relations with one another, as her punishment for his demand that she give up the changeling boy. So, Queen Titania falls in love with an ass because we oftentimes fall in love with asses. How's that for timeless and universal concerns and issues? And we don't even see it until after the fact. And it turns out that, and this is how Shakespeare helps to forward the plot, is that Fairy Oberon sees the human lovers and feels a certain level of empathy for Helena because she has unrequited love. She's got love problems. And perhaps he sees himself in her because he has his own love problems. But regardless, he decides to tell Puck, well, put the love juice on Demetrius. No, put the love juice on the man wearing the Athenian garb so that he will love Helena again. And of course, that's the key. The man wearing the Athenian garb, two men wearing Athenian garb. That is both Demetrius and Lysander. So Puck either accidentally, mistakenly puts the love juice on the wrong man, or follows orders and is quite aware that he is putting the love juice in the wrong person's eyes, but he's going to do it anyway because he wants to see what the results will be because he enjoys chaos. A lot of this will be dependent on a director and an actor on how they play Puck, whether it seems that Puck makes an innocent mistake or this quote mistake unquote is anything but a mistake. It's very deliberate because Puck basically followed the letter of the orders he was given. He puts the love juice on the eyes of the man wearing the Athenian garb, which happens to be the wrong man, Lysander. So when Lysander awakes, he's now in love with Helena rather than Hermia. And then when Puck tries to fix this mistake, the love juice is placed on the correct man's eyes, Demetrius, but never removed from Lysander's eyes. So now we have the exact opposite of what we had at the beginning of the play. We have two men in love with one woman, but it's a different woman. At the beginning of the play, both men are in love with Hermia, the short brunette. By the middle of the play, both men are in love with the tall blonde, Helena. The tall blonde believes that this is just a horrible joke that's being played on her. And her best friend, who will soon become her former best friend, is convinced that, well, her best friend is stealing her man. And that's going to lead to what I call the catfight scene in Act 3 of the play. We had talked about that Shakespeare's plays are divided into 5 acts. The first act, and you can think of it as a kind of pyramid. So the first act, which would be at the bottom left side of the pyramid, we're introduced to characters. Second act, when we're beginning to ascend that pyramid, we're beginning to get conflict. The third act, which would be the point in the pyramid, is the height of conflict. And this is where all the lovers are ready to come to blows with one another. This is where the insults are flying between Helena and Hermia. One of my favorite insults is when Hermia calls her former best friend Helena a painted maypole. And if you remember what I said before, that a maypole is a phallic symbol in May Day. So she's just called her former best friend a phallic symbol. Painted would be makeup. In other words, a false face, unnatural beauty. Themes that we talked about with the sonnets. So in other words, the painted maypole is a reference to a strumpet as well as to a phallus. How's that for an insult? That you wouldn't necessarily know unless you read and examined the play very carefully. If this were a tragedy, these lovers would come to blows. But of course, we have a comedy, so everything has to be rectified. So, of course, the love juice is going to be removed from the wrong man's eyes. So, the love juice will be removed from Lysander's eyes. So now he's back in love with Hermia. And Hermia is willing to forgive him. And I know that's a problematic happy ending, particularly in 2025, that she would so easily disregard all of the insults and all of the horrors that have occurred. Um, but that's the way that it would be read or at least accepted during the Renaissance. The love juice remains on Lysander's eyes, which also is somewhat problematic as a happy ending because he's being manipulated to love Helena, whom he doesn't love. But prior to the play, he did. So that gets to the question of what kind of loyalty or commitment should one have when one declares one's love to another. And during the time of the Renaissance, this would have been seen as a way to rectify and to give a happy ending with a coupling that existed prior to the play. That means that all of the nobles are happy. So all that's left is Hermia's father, Aegeus, who's unhappy. And remember that King Theseus needs to make a ruling, and he decides that since all the nobles are happy, he's going to let things be. In other words, Aegeus is not going to get his way, and Hermia is going to get her way. Again, a rather progressive ending, the idea that a female could get her way. But we won't see that with the fairies, because with Oberon and Titania, we see how Titania has been manipulated to fall in love with a literal and figurative ass. And when the love juice is removed from her eyes, she sees the humiliation and she loses that changeling boy. And she's willing to accept all of these events so that we can have the quote happy ending. Again, somewhat problematic from a 2025 perspective. But at the time of the Renaissance, it would have been seen that, yes, they can make amends to one another. And particularly because the play doesn't end on that note, the play is going to end with the play within a play, which is Bottom and his cohorts. So if you see in the notes below where I've sort of summarized some of what I've just talked about, and in terms of thinking about the play within a play, Pyramus and Thisbe, this is a ridiculous play. It's poorly written and it's poorly acted. It almost reminds me of an elementary school production. And this was very deliberate on Shakespeare's part. Shakespeare wanted to show us what his competition was doing by illustrating how poorly written those plays would be and how poorly acted those plays would be. So Pyramus and Thisbe is an opportunity for Shakespeare to make a dig on his competition and say to us that we can spend our time watching plays from his competition, or we could see the good stuff, like A Midsummer Night's Dream, or Romeo and Juliet, because it's thought that Romeo and Juliet was written during the same time. So whether Romeo and Juliet was written before Midsummer Night's Dream, again, we aren't exactly sure of the dates. And what that would mean is that people would recognize the play Romeo and Juliet that they saw before. It would be easy for them to compare and contrast how good Romeo and Juliet was in comparison to Pyramus and Thisbe. Or the exact opposite, that Romeo and Juliet will be coming out shortly. What a great advertisement for Shakespeare to show us Pyramus and Thisbe, poorly written and a poorly acted play, and then shortly thereafter indicate that he has his own tragic play about love called Romeo and Juliet, but it'll be a much better play. So we see poor writing and poor acting as Shakespeare's commentary on his competition, but we also see a lot of humor. We also see a lot of sex jokes, which I will be talking about a little bit next class because I'm aware of the time as well. And all of the major characters in A Midsummer Night's Dream are watching the play within a play. So we've got King Theseus and Queen Hippolyta, as well as all of the nobles, Hermia, Helena, Lysander, and Demetrius. And they're having a grand old time watching. Never once do they stop to consider that they themselves were equally ridiculous and absurd when it came to love. But for them, it was real. What they're watching is a play. And this is a commentary for us. And this is where the play gets a little bit uncomfortable. Because, of course, Midsummer Night's Dream is not real. It's fiction. So all of these characters that we've been seeing and laughing at and mocking, well, obviously they're not real. But if we are laughing at any of the play, and we never once stop to consider that we ourselves have been equally absurd and ridiculous when it's come to love, whether we've been blind in love or we've been involved in unrequited love, or whether our love has been changeable and fickle, or any of the other commentaries that we see with love in the play. Even the fact that it's possible to fall in love with an ass. Well, then, if we can't acknowledge this about ourselves, then we've learned nothing after seeing A Midsummer Night's Dream. At least Shakespeare's equal opportunity, as I say it, and that fact that he likes to criticize everybody in love relationships, that we're all ridiculous when it comes to love. It makes a lot of sense at this particular point that, well, Shakespeare might want to have an apology, because probably just about everybody is offended in one way or another by the ending of the play, in terms of audience members that could be watching this play, which is where we get Puck, of course, the only character not involved in a love relationship, giving an apology if we shadows have offended. But that speech is complicated too, because it seems like a backhanded apology. Puck says, "If I am an honest Puck." We know Puck isn't honest. So one wonders how sincere his apology is at the end. Again, that shows Shakespeare's brilliance. So you can see in the notes below, I've gone through the first act about midsummer being a pagan summer solstice, night being associated with darkness and mystery, love being like a dream, Athens representing civilization and order, Hippolyta being that strong female queen, Hermia, the short brunette who defies Aegeus, Theseus, the Athens ruler who conquered Hippolyta. So basically, what I'm trying to do is to give you the characters and a sense of what's happening in Act 1, where Demetrius is Hermia's father's choice, but he never indicates why, nor does he need to, because he's the father and he can make that decision. And Fairy Titania forswearing Oberon's marriage bed. Basically everything that I've talked about thus far. So we see in that first act that love is fickle. We see arranged marriages over romantic marriages, and we see power struggles. And then in Act 2, as I had talked about, where all of the characters end up in the wilderness, or at least all of the major characters, the quote mistake that Puck makes, that maybe is not a mistake, about putting the love juice on the man wearing the Athenian garb. So now that both men are in love with Helena, not Hermia, Act 2 illustrates how love is irrational, it's humiliating, and it acts like a magical spell. And then Act 3, perhaps my favorite act, is where we've got the lovers basically fighting with one another to show that love can lead to conflicts, can destroy friendships, and can be blind. And then in Act 4 is what we usually get at the ending of a Shakespearean play, which is resolution. So we get the happy ending. So Hermia and Lysander are going to get their way, and they're going to be a happy couple. Helena and Demetrius return to where they were pre-plague. So they are a couple, and that's considered a happy ending. Fairy Oberon gets the changeling boy, and Titania realizes she loved an ass and is willing to forgive Fairy Oberon. And what do we see in Act 4? Love's complicated, just like some of these resolutions are complicated. Love is unpredictable, such as some of these resolutions are unpredictable. And love is surprising. And then we get the Act 5, which seems to be tacked on, but it's more than just tacked on. We get the Pyramus and Thisbe performance, where we're shown how love can go bad, which is what could have happened in the third act in Midsummer if these lovers had come to blows. And we see the lack of insight about love, as all of the major characters are watching Pyramus and Thisbe, but they never see their own absurdity. We're asked to reflect upon ourselves. Do we see our own absurdity about love when we're laughing throughout A Midsummer Night's Dream? And we also see Shakespeare taking a dig at his competition with bad acting and bad writing. So, some themes. Love makes everybody, regardless of age, regardless of status, an idiot. Love destroys friendships. Love is like a spell or a dream. Beauty need not be tall and blonde. You remember some of the Dark Lady sonnets, we talked about this. Females can defy male powerful figures. Sometimes, not always. Virginity is so important, and there are references in the play that both of the female characters are virginal. You're not supposed to lose virginity until after marriage. But setting the play in midsummer and talking about it on May Day, days that are associated with sexual celebrations, leads to that tension. And of course, the donkey and the ass being the most well endowed creature in the animal kingdom is also a reference to sexuality. So, what I wanted to do was to have you reflect upon language now that I've talked about themes and some plot. So, that'll be our attendance question. That'll be due on Friday, the 28th. So, you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, though you're certainly encouraged to, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn, which I have been doing in your discussion forums, to identify an important quote in Midsummer Night's Dream and indicate why you think that quote is important. So, my hope is that all of you will select different quotes. So, by the ending of this, when you read all of the quotes that your classmates have selected, you'll have a good overview of some of the important quotes. I, of course, will fill in some of those important quotes as well next class. And if you need additional time, you can certainly ask for an extension, but getting that in by Friday the 28th is very useful so that your classmates can read those quotes and might begin to reflect on what they might write a paper upon if they decided to write a paper about A Midsummer Night's Dream. However, there is another play that will be coming up that I hope you're beginning, and that happens to be Much Ado About Nothing, and I will give you the link for that. You can find that on lots of places on the internet, but as I'm fond of the Folger Shakespeare Library, that's considered to be the premier library for Shakespearean studies in the United States, that's the link that I will share with you. So I hope that this video helped to clarify perhaps some questions that you might have had about the play. And keep in mind that if you wanted to rewatch the version from the Globe Theater, there is a time limit on that through the GCC library. The good news is I'll be showing you other kinds of versions over the course of the semester. And all of those thus far I've been able to find as free links. We'll see if I'm able to continue to do that this semester, which means that you could see them at your leisure. But the GCC library does have the DVD version of this Globe performance, so that if it turns out that you wanted to rewatch it on your own after the time limit has elapsed, you can go to the GCC library and actually see the DVD. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, putting some closure onto A Midsummer Night's Dream, talking a little bit about paper number 1, and introducing the idea of our next play, Much Ado About Nothing. Take care. Bye-bye.